Canada just made a move that could change the oil game. While the US expected more Canadian oil to flow its way, Canada chose a path that could send much of it somewhere else. This could bring big gains for Canada, but leave the US facing a problem it never saw coming. In April 2026, Donald Trump signed an executive order at the White House authorizing the Bridger Pipeline project, a proposed 550,000 barrel per day crude oil pipeline running from the Canada-US border through Wyoming and into existing American midstream infrastructure. The order was framed as a major step toward continental energy security and a demonstration of American commitment to Canadian oil. 16 days later, Mark Carney stood in Calgary and signed the Carney-Smith Implementation Agreement with Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, committing Canada to a national interest designation for a 1 million barrel per day West Coast pipeline, targeting Asian markets. Two simultaneous pipeline announcements, two opposite directions. That is the oil battle currently playing out between Ottawa and Washington. The Bridger Pipeline's commercial architecture explains exactly why Washington wants it. The project is being developed by South Bow Corporation, formerly the Liquids Pipelines division of TC Energy, the same company that built Keystone XL before its cancellation and targets the same basic commercial logic as the original Keystone project: move heavy Alberta crude from the Hardisty, Alberta hub southward into American refinery infrastructure. The proposed Bridger route would run from the Canadian border through Wyoming, connecting into the existing Platte pipeline system and moving crude toward Midwest and Gulf Coast refineries. South Bow is targeting a final investment decision in 2027, with first oil potentially flowing as early as 2030. At 550,000 barrels per day, Bridger would represent approximately 16% of Canada's current total oil production capacity, flowing exclusively into American infrastructure. In May, despite the fraught relations between Canada and the United States under Trump's second term, the two countries are growing more interdependent than ever on oil, much to the chagrin of the Canadian government. That phrase, chagrin of the Canadian government, describes the specific tension the Bridger authorization has created. The United States already receives approximately 60% of all American crude oil imports from Canada. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, are physically configured to process Alberta's heavy bitumen blends. Replacing that supply with alternative crude would require capital expenditure on refinery modifications that American operators have no incentive to make. The dependency runs both ways, but its structural weight falls more heavily on the American refineries that have specialized their equipment around Canadian crude than on Canadian producers who can, in theory, sell the same barrel into Asian markets at Brent-linked prices. The West Coast pipeline that the May 15th Carney-Smith Implementation Agreement targets is the commercial alternative to that dependency. The agreement commits both governments to achieving a national interest designation for the pipeline by October 1st, 2026, with a formal proposal submitted to the Federal Major Projects Office by July 1st, 2026. 1 million barrels per day to British Columbia's northern coast, routed through one of the 4 corridor options now documented in Alberta's internal planning materials and published following an ATIP release in June 2026. At a Brent price versus the West Texas Intermediate differential that typically runs between $3 and $8 per barrel, 1 million barrels per day reaching Asian buyers rather than American refineries represents between $3 million and $8 million per day in additional revenue for Canadian producers, approximately $1.1 billion to $2.9 billion annually at the range's midpoints. The LNG Canada context underscores that the West Coast diversification is already operational at one end of the corridor. LNG Canada exported 1 million metric tons of liquefied natural gas to Asia in April 2026, a monthly production record from its Phase 1 facility in Kitimat, British Columbia. The Enbridge Sunrise Pipeline expansion, adding 300 million cubic feet per day of natural gas capacity to LNG Canada's feedstock supply, is in progress. Shell's $27 billion acquisition of ARC Resources, announced April 27, 2026, locks ARC's Montney natural gas production into Shell's 40% stake in LNG Canada, building the upstream feedstock base for a potential Phase 2 expansion. The natural gas export corridor to Asia is already producing. The crude oil corridor to Asia is the pipeline the implementation agreement is designed to build. Carney's own framing of what the American relationship has become is on the record and specific. In May 2026, He described the situation as a rupture rather than a transition, declaring that Canada's economic strategy needs to change dramatically and rapidly in response to a bilateral relationship that is structurally altered. That language is not diplomatically ambiguous. It is the Prime Minister of the United States' largest energy supplier, describing the terms of the relationship in terms that make the West Coast Pipeline not a strategic hedge, but a commercial necessity. We have to be honest about what's happening. The US is a more difficult partner than it used to be. Carney stated, framing the diversification strategy as a direct response to documented changes in American trade and foreign policy rather than a theoretical long-term planning exercise. The specific financial scale attached to the West Coast Pipeline's national interest designation process connects to the $34 billion figure in the title. The Pathways Alliance carbon capture project, valued at $16.5 billion and mutually dependent on the pipeline as a condition of Alberta's cooperation in the implementation agreement, represents one component. The pipeline construction cost itself for a 1 million barrel per day corridor from Alberta to BC's northern coast is estimated in the range of $15 billion to $20 billion, depending on route selection and terrain. Combined with the Pathways Alliance, the total committed capital for the combined pipeline and carbon capture program sits in the $30 billion to $36 billion range. The $34 billion figure sits at the midpoint of that documented range, covering the two major capital commitments that together define what the Carney-Smith Agreement actually sets in motion. Trump's April 30th Bridger authorization and Carney's May 15th implementation agreement are not competing press releases. They are competing commercial architectures for the same underlying resource. The question they are jointly answering, who gets the next generation of Canadian crude oil export infrastructure, determines whether Alberta's production growth in the 2030s flows into American refineries that are already configured to receive it, or into Asian markets that are willing to pay Brent-linked prices for it. South Bow is targeting a final investment decision in 2027 for Bridger. Canada's West Coast Pipeline is targeting a national interest designation by October 1st, 2026, 5 months ahead of South Bow's investment decision timeline. The race to determine which route gets built first is already underway, and the outcome will shape North American energy trade for decades. The tanker moratorium remains the unresolved legal obstacle sitting directly in front of the West Coast Pipeline's northern route options. The Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, enacted in 2019, prohibits crude oil tankers from loading at terminals on British Columbia's northern coast, the precise geography where 3 of the 4 route options in Alberta's internal planning documents terminate. The Carney-Smith implementation agreement commits both governments to working toward resolution of that moratorium as a condition of the pipeline's viability, but no amendment to the act has been introduced in Parliament and no legislative vehicle for modifying it has been publicly specified. The July 1st proposal, submission to the Major Projects Office, will force the route question into public view, revealing which terminal location the pipeline targets, and therefore which version of the tanker moratorium conflict requires a legal or legislative resolution before construction can begin.